still more important given the topic of this discussion. Well, speaking truth to power is an expression used in several occasions, but maybe the best known quote is from Edward Said, who wrote, the essential purpose of the public intellectual is speaking truth to power. With this meaning that social scientists have an obligation to contribute to public discourse, to public debate, on the basis of the findings of their own research, but with no preoccupation of presenting views that may be not liked by power holders. So that's the most frequent use of this expression. We can find several different positions on the question of the relation between social science and power holders of our actors in society. There are those who think that the autonomy of social science should be preserved at any cost, and so they prefer to develop their work in closed circle, often with rather idiosyncratic language, with little relation to other publics, other major actors in society, public and private. Of course, the risk of this position is irrelevance, or the fact that even if there are interesting findings, they are confined to very limited circle of people initiated. On the other hand, we may find scholars who see themselves very much as experts giving advice to clients, both private and public, taking for granted the basic questions and trying to provide expertise, just answers, advice, whatever. Then we have those who are in this area, if you want, but select a specific type of, quote, client. All those engage in advocacy social science. They speak in the name of people who usually do not speak. In general, I have to say that social scientists have to walk a tiny line, in the sense that they, and here I'm normative, if you allow me, should avoid irrelevance, avoid hyper-specialized language, be concerned with major issues of the society of their epoch. But at the same time, they should maintain a kind of attitude of critical distance, cherishing, protecting at any cost their own independence of judgment, and in this way contributing to a real, relevant public debate. Here we have many other questions, of course, questions of communicating, well, being able to communicate, to be heard, to be able to transform rigorously based research, methodological and theoretically rigorous research, into propositions that can be understood by and debated by the larger public. And we have the most serious point, which have to do with the need to contextualize this problem. We cannot just talk in general terms, but we have to analyze the role of the social scientist in different political systems, in different social systems. Because, of course, there is a lot of difference in terms of political regime, and the space of autonomy of social scientists and intellectuals in general can vary very much. Here we have, of course, the major issues of freedom of thinking, freedom of speech, as essential components of the rights which pertain to each individual. Our international scientific associations, I did it when I was president of the International Sociological Association, have often intervened in order to defend freedom of research, freedom of publication, freedom of speech for colleagues living in countries which react to any kind of independent research which can imply criticism of the power holder policies. But in general, I would say that even in democratic countries, the problem exists of being able to protect the area of scientific inquiry, scientific research, from many attempts, several different attempts, to curtail it, coming both from market and state. I just refer to Habermas, and you know that certainly there is a problem of commodification of knowledge on the one hand, and of attempt intrusion of political power to encourage, finance, fund only that kind of research that can be coherent with their own policy preferences. So the real problem for the social scientists is to be interested, concerned, capable of identifying real issues, not being afraid at all of dealing related to political power, to private and public actors in society, but maintaining herself, himself, at a critical distance, and maintaining a commitment to truth. Here we may just remember the two famous joint lectures of Max Weber, Wissenschaft als Beruf, Politik als Beruf. Knowing that, of course, it's a commitment to truth. It's not the pretension that we have the truth and the other not, or that our truths are always scientifically based and the other are not. But a commitment to truth is a commitment to honestly look for empirically based, theoretically sound results, findings, and a commitment to put them into the public debate without being, as I said, constrained or restrained by private or public actors who may resent certain kind of results because they are not in line with their own expectations, or because they are critical of their behavior, of their basic choices. I think we can discuss this matter with very appropriate panelists because of their own life history. We will start with Denise Livesley, who is a social statistician, right, and who has a long career of interacting with public policymakers, but also a strong commitment, of course, to the methods, to the basic rules of her own discipline and of scientific method in general. Please, Denise.
Thank you.
Maybe you prefer to go there. Okay.
Yes, I think so. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm speaking truth to power. I'm speaking from the perspective of statistics, so I want to talk about the battle for good statistics, and insofar as statistics can reflect the truth. That's really the topic of my talk. I don't think I need to spend time with an audience such as this to explain why official statistics, because that's my concentration this morning, is important to social science research. Good statistics are absolutely essential for good government, for the delivery of public services, for decision making in all sectors of society, for empowerment of the general public, for managing development and ensuring that policies reflect the needs of the people, for democracy, providing Parliament and the public with a window on society and the economy, and on the work and performance of government. So statistics are fundamental for evidence-based policy, for helping people to make well-informed decisions about policies, programmes and projects, by putting the best available evidence, and I'll come back to that in a minute, from research to the heart of policy development and implementation. It's also about enlightening through making explicit what's known through scientific evidence, and importantly, what isn't known too. So that's part of the truth, is what we don't know as well as what we do know. And that's in contrast to opinion-based policy, which relies heavily on either selective use of information or the untested views of individuals or groups, often inspired by ideological standpoints, prejudices, or speculative conjecture. And what we in the statistics world despair of, policy-based evidence as opposed to evidence-based policy. One of the key points that I want to make is that we need an evidence base at all stages in the policy cycle, in shaping agendas, defining issues, identifying options, making choices of action, delivering them, and monitoring their impact and outcomes. So one of the concerns that I have is the issue about who sets the agenda. And one of the particular concerns I have at the moment, not just in my work in the United Kingdom, but also in relation to my work that's taken place internationally, is the extent to which statistics, or social statistics in particular, is being confined to performance targets, decontextualized indicators relating to often rather routine sets of targets developed by governments. And I will come back to this because this is one of the themes of my talk. So data information must be driven by policy needs, and we need to maintain independence. And again, a theme is, how do we create an environment in which we can be policy relevant, but also independent? So achieving an appropriate balance between these two is not straightforward, and it's particularly difficult in situations of resource constraints. So it's particularly difficult in some developing countries where there's limited funding and resources for data collection. A prerequisite for evidence-based policy and for what in the developing countries is often called managing for results, so it's more or less the equivalent of evidence-based policy, is that data must be trustworthy. And that depends upon the quality of the data and the quality of the professional statisticians, the people who are involved in collecting the data. By quality of professional statisticians, I mean the environment in which they work, their support, their independence, their relationship to professional associations, their ability to have continuing professional development. Quality of data, by quality of data, I mean a whole range of things. Okay, so I mean right through from the relevance to policy, through potential disaggregation, their currency, their punctuality, their coherence, their clarity and transparency. One of the issues in international data is comparability through standards and consistency over time and space, efficient use of the resources that we've got, And very importantly, accessibility and affordability, because one of the issues in relation to seeking the truth is who is going to have access to that information to enable them to judge the truth. But it isn't enough that data are trustworthy, they also need to be trusted. And if they aren't trusted, then they won't be used, and there will be fights over the data rather than over the issues. So what we strive for is that data are the currency of public debates. That's not to say there won't be different interpretations of the same information. It's not to say that we're striving for perfect data. Indeed, the comment made yesterday about, in one of the sessions, about vague, timely data being more and correct, vague data that is broadly correct is better than precise data that is wrong. And timeliness is also important in that issue, that data that are gathered and made available too late to make decisions are of no use at all. So I'm not arguing for perfection in terms of data. I'm arguing for relevance in the broadest sense. Trust comes on foot but leaves on horseback. One of the things that those of you involved in data collection will be aware of is that you build up trust incrementally and slowly, but it can disappear in the instance, particularly if there's major violations in terms of, say, manipulation or corruption of data. I'm not naive. The policy-making process by which governments translate their political vision into programs and actions to achieve desired changes, evidence is only one part of that process, only one input. And I'm sure you can think of many others that I haven't thought of there that are inputs into the policy process. So I'm not arguing that statistics is to be used on its own. Obviously, it's used alongside a lot of other information. I'm also arguing that all evidence is imperfect. And the absence of excellence evidence doesn't make evidence-based decision-making impossible. What's required is the best evidence available, not the best evidence possible. Dr. Muir Gray, who works in the National Health System in the UK, it's a quotation from him. And that evidence rarely provides neat and tidy prescriptions to decision makers as to what they should do. Often it generates more questions to be resolved. So seeking after the truth is not a simple process. And evidence is sometimes resisted. I love this quote from John Maynard Keynes. There's nothing a government hates more than to be well informed, for it makes the process of arriving at decisions much more complicated and difficult. We're also in the situation, as our chairman alluded to, that often there are inconvenient truths. Governments tend to prefer good news stories. Bad news stories are often delayed or buried. Researchers who produce bad news stories may be vulnerable in terms of not getting continued funding. Too many governments are focused on populism, what they judge to be the requirements or the wishes of the public. We already heard in one of the presentations yesterday about governments' horizons being much shorter than those of social researchers. So there's a problem in terms of timeliness. And often governments prefer their own spin to that of the statistician or the social researcher. One of the things that we joke about as statisticians, but unfortunately makes us very sad in the UK, is that we say that most government statistics are actually trailed on the BBC radio programme, the Today programme, that says government statistics to be released later today will show. and then you get the government's spin on those data. Burying bad news, I don't know if you'll all be aware of this story from 9/11, that a senior government advisor in the UK suggested that controversial stories could be buried in the news fallout from the US terror attacks. She actually sent a memo saying that it would be a good time to bury some controversial stories. Sir Gus O'Donnell, the Secretary to the UK Cabinet, recently said that he wanted the Office for National Statistics, he actually said statisticians more generally, but he was referring to the Office for National Statistics, to be boring, to put out the plain facts and nothing but the facts, and on clear and predictable deadlines. Well, I agree with the clear and predictable deadlines. It would then be for politicians and government press officers to interpret the figures, he added. The Royal Statistical Society, we had great fun drafting a letter to him, and we argued in that letter that it's clearly the task of official statisticians to interpret the figures in a statistical context to facilitate understanding and avoid misunderstanding. And indeed, we pointed out to him that the code of practice for the UK, of the UK Statistics Authority, that covers all government statisticians, explicitly states that official statistics should be accompanied by full and frank commentary, should be readily accessible to all users, and that all UK bodies that are responsible for official statistics should prepare and disseminate commentary and analysis that aid interpretation and provide factual information about the policy or operational context of official statistics. This is a few weeks ago. We await an answer. So there are important aspects of building trust. One of the things that is important to building trust is the autonomy of the official statistics office. And that's often protected by statistical legislation. Last year I was working in Ethiopia at the Economic Commission for Africa, and one of the things that we were working on there was trying to get statistical legislation passed through parliaments in all African countries. The existence of an independent statistical board is important, and it really must be independent. I myself have had bad experiences of governing boards that have not been independent and are therefore not helpful in this process. The development of codes of conduct is critical. Breaches of codes should be identified, investigated, and publicised. The appointment of the head of statistics should be removed from the political process. Users should be involved in setting the agenda, so ensuring that awkward questions are asked. Statistical processes should be externally audited, and the audit body should, in my view, report to Parliament, not to the government of the day. Why are we worried about trust in the UK? Well, this slide from Eurobarometer 2007 shows a question about trust in official statistics across all of the EU countries. And the Netherlands and Denmark are at one end, France and the UK are at the other end, the UK being bottom in terms of public trust in official statistics. So it's one of the reasons why we're very concerned about the issue. So what steps are we taking, particularly in the UK, to counteract the lack of trust? Well, we're trying to ensure that there's no political interference with the data, and importantly, no perception that there is. So issues as to who has access to data prior to its release is critical. And those who have prior access are identified. The length of time of prior access has been limited. It's been reduced from 8 days to just over a day, and the Statistics Authority is trying to reduce it further. So in Canada, it's 1 hour. Data should be released by the statisticians and separated from the political spin, and leakages actively investigated, as happened just recently where knife crime statistics was leaked by the government. I mentioned earlier the balance between relevance and independence, and this is a critical issue. As a social statistician, I'm working now with social scientists more generally, I would argue that it's really critical that we foster engagement between social scientists inside government and social scientists and other policymakers, social scientists and other policymakers inside government and social scientists outside government. Fostering engagement is really important. Yesterday I heard the term co-opted but not corrupted, and I think that's a lovely, lovely phrase. Professional bodies' codes of ethics are really important, and I mentioned there the code of ethics for my own organisation, the International Statistics Institute, which contains information such as, or guidance, such as not accepting funding, which is predicated on getting a particular result. The importance of independent think tanks is critical. In one of the UK newspapers on Friday, the Institute of Fiscal Studies was described as a sort of non-partisan, unofficial opposition party equipped with massive brain power, almost entirely economists. And it tells us that the distance between our richest and our least fortunate citizens is as high as it has been since their data started in 1961. So the importance of independent think tanks such as the Institute for Fiscal Studies are critical. Professional norms, particularly with respect to publication and ensuring this publication and ensuring that data are available for others to analyse, is critical. And we also need to protect the independence of research councils and make sure that they are co-opted but not corrupted. Challenges to integrity, well, one of the things that I think is a major challenge is the rise of performance monitoring. Performance data that are used to establish what works amongst policy initiatives, to identify well-performing and or underperforming institutions and public servants. Obviously, they're really important in terms of holding ministers to account for their stewardship. But there's a difficulty, and that is that government is both monitoring the public services and being monitored by performance indicators. And because of this dual role, performance monitoring has to be done with integrity and shielded from undue political interference. And certainly in the UK, and I know in a number of other countries, there have been problems in this regard. So thinking about performance monitoring internationally, and one might think about the Millennium Development Goals in this regard. One of the difficulties is that these goals are being used for accountability of governments. They're being used internally in order to change policies, but they're also being used externally for accountability. And the results matter. A lot of funding can be predicated on these results. One of the difficulties is that it's assumed that sort of one size fits all, and the relevance isn't always obvious. So we have problems of the distorting effects of measurement. I know, having worked as a UN statistician for 7 years, that validation can be extraordinarily difficult. If the education minister for a country insists that 98% of the children in his country are in school, it can be extraordinarily difficult to actually disprove that. We are reliant upon official data. And the national user community is often underdeveloped and under-resourced. I assume I've about 5 minutes? Fine. So seeking the truth in international context can be difficult. One of the critical issues is who sets the agenda in terms of what we're measuring. I've mentioned the dependence on official data from governments. There can be perverse incentives to report in particular ways. How do we challenge governments who mislead us with data? One of the critical issues is the UN, an organization of people or of governments, and sometimes it's conflicted. And the difficulty is that how you, within the UN system, you challenge data that is apparently incorrect. So how do we ensure that the UN fundamental principles of official statistics are applied? We need to support initiatives to establish professional associations in some of the poorer countries to provide support for those people involved in data collection. And we need to bolster the role of international professional associations, such as the ISSC and my own, the ISI, and the Sociological Association, where I was very pleased that you took a stance on issues of truth. The evidence base is urgently needed in developing countries and emerging economies. The problems are severe and urgent. We need data that is owned by the countries in order to empower them. We need to develop policies which are relevant to their needs and ensure effective implementation. To counteract corruption, paucity of data is a major obstacle, and so is the lack of recognition or much acceptance of much of the data that's produced. A really great paper that I'd refer you to, I don't have time to discuss now, was written by Christopher Scott of LSE for Paris 21. Paris 21 stands for Partnerships in Statistics for Development for the 21st Century. And it's an organization hosted by the OECD. And in his paper, he talks about the use of good statistics having a positive effect on policy. 2 examples from his paper there. And the absence of data or failure to use available information having a negative effect on policy. 2 examples from his paper there. So turning to my topic, speaking truth to power, I would argue we need to be in an environment where we're prepared to address the big issues, to collect and report data even if they're uncomfortable for the government of the day, to address inequities in our societies, to exercise our responsibilities to use information to improve the well-being of the global poor. And my final slide is one from Roy Ramanoff from the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, who talks about we need leadership rooted and committed to the core values of a nation and its people that drives and inspires diverse partners to work collaboratively towards a common objective, focused on the excellence of our evidence, informed by an overriding commitment to stay grounded and accountable to citizens, that is bold and dares to dream no little dreams of how we can build even better nations and ultimately a better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Very interesting and appropriate. Now, Pierre Sanet, who is Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences at UNESCO, and has been for 9 years, between 1992 and 2001, Secretary General of Amnesty International. So, thank you very much. Please, Pierre.
Good morning, everybody. I have been asked to contrast my experience of speaking truth to power, my experiences at Amnesty International with my experiences at UNESCO. I was for 9 years Secretary General of Amnesty International, and I've been now for 9 years Assistant Director General at UNESCO. So when I joined UNESCO, I was asked time and time and time again, how are you adjusting to UNESCO? I answered, I am. And then, but the two organizations are different. My answer was, I know. But you were working on human rights, and now I am still working on human rights. But one is an NGO and the other one is governments. And the answer is, I know. So, but the true questions behind these anodyne questions was actually, can you continue to speak truth to power in the same way you used to do before? Now, you are telling me the organization is different, the mission is different, the methods of work are different, followed by, can you continue to do the same thing as you did before? Now, suppose I am a football player and I change tack and I join a basketball team. Are you going to ask me whether I will continue to play football on the basketball ground? Now, what these questions fail to acknowledge is that there are different ways to play ball and that there are different ways to speak truth to power. Now, what do we mean by truth? What do we mean by power? And what do we mean by speak? Meanings for the word truth extends from honesty, good faith, and sincerity in general, to agreement with fact or reality in particular. The term has no single definition about which a majority of professional philosophers and scholars agree, and various theories of truth can be elaborated. But for the sake of the presentation today, I will retain those two elements: one, conformity to fact or actuality, and the second one, sincerity, integrity, honesty, good faith. When it comes to power, we are talking here about the ability, legal, official capacity to exercise control, authority, to act, to influence. So we're talking about either the government with direct responsibility or other actors with influence, such as other governments, international organizations, business community, the media, civil society. And then when we talk about speak, we're talking here about communication. It doesn't mean necessarily screaming or shouting. Not remaining silent doesn't mean shouting. It is about conveying a message, and the purpose is to solicit action. But in order to be listened to, you have to be credible. Now, if I compare the missions of the two organizations, the mission of Amnesty is to expose allegations of human rights violation, to campaign in order to put pressure on government to investigate and prosecute, and it is for the court of law to establish the truth, not for Amnesty International, for the courts of law, to establish the truth, to punish the perpetrators, and to compensate the victims. Now, the organization works on the basis of certain principles: accuracy, impartiality, independence, universal coverage. First, accuracy. Now, accuracy, what does it mean? Because if you do not abide by that principle, you may lose your credibility. Let me contrast you two examples. During the war, the first Gulf War, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, Amnesty published a story which in the end revealed to be a false story that was planted by security services of Kuwait and of the United States. The story was that the Iraqi soldiers, when they invaded Kuwait, they disconnected tubes of babies in maternities, okay? And they threw that away. And that story was published by Amnesty International after an investigation in the refugee camps and picked up by the international press and was one of the issues that was used to further justify the war against Iraq. But that was a false story which we discovered afterwards. Because we were in a rush to publish in order to stop atrocities committed by the Iraqi army, we unfortunately fell for that story that was planted and published it. So that was a big mistake, but Amnesty after that recognized that it committed a big mistake. The second one is the genocide in Rwanda. The international community, and I include Amnesty International, was very slow in qualifying what was happening in Rwanda, because when the killing started, it was not evident that it was a genocide and that there was genocidal intention. It could have been mass killings, it could have been reprisals for the assassination of the president. It was not clear in the beginning whether only the Tutsi were targeted, because also moderate Hutus were targeted. So there were debates, endless debates, as to whether we qualify this as a genocide and then call for the activation of the Convention Against Genocide, which requests intervention, armed intervention from the international community to stop it, or whether these were killings in reprisal. So it took us days, because we wanted to be careful, of course, before calling it a genocide or not. So it took us days, and it took days to the international community before the international community agreed that what was happening in our very eyes was actually a genocide. So the principle of accuracy can therefore be paralyzing, because you want to make sure that what you are making public conforms to facts, to reality. The second principle is the principle of impartiality. Impartiality, because very often human rights organizations are seen as being embedded with the opposition. Now, it happens that in non-democratic countries, it is usually the oppositions that constitute the contingent of political prisoners and prisoners of conscience. I'll give you an example. For instance, the case of Côte d'Ivoire before the coup of 1999. I had endless arguments with the government to convince the government that we were not motivated by political alignment with an opposition party, but we were just concerned with the rights that everybody had concerning freedom of expression, etc. After the coup, 1999, those same ministers who were deeply suspicious of the motivations of Amnesty got arrested. And when they received protection from Amnesty International, after their release and after the campaign by the organization to mobilize public opinion to get them released, when I met them afterwards, they said, now I understand when you talk about impartiality. Independence. Independence, the test of independence and of being seen independent is also the source of your funding. And that is why the organization is solely funded by the contribution of the members. In the constitution of the organization, it cannot accept government funding, funding from business, funding from international organization, because if one of your main funding is from country X, and if country X is in conflict with country Y, if you are funded by country X, then your credibility will be at stake when you talk to the government of country Y. And therefore, independence is extremely important. And the last principle, the principle of universal coverage, which ensures that you cannot be accused of double standards or of selectivity, covering human rights violations everywhere at all times, and taking action against violations committed in any country in the world. So universal coverage, as a matter of principle, is extremely important in order to build the credibility of the organization, because the first argument that an offending government will oppose to you is, how about country Y? You are criticizing us, but you are not criticizing our neighbor. So the adherence to all these principles is to make the ethical position unassailable and to build the credibility in order to be able to speak from a position of moral power, to which has been added, I should mention, indivisibility, because it is difficult to campaign only on a set of rights and leave the other set of rights, especially social economic rights, aside. So at the end of the day, speaking truth to power in an organization like Amnesty International is about the power of facts and the power of law, the international human rights law. In UNESCO, the mission of the organization is different. The mission is to develop international standards, to encourage international cooperation, to build capacity in order to empower governments to act in fields of education, science, culture, communication, by taking progressive measures that fulfill rights such as the right to education, circulation of ideas, free circulation of ideas, promotion of cultural diversity, poverty elimination, etc., through the promotion of rights and values. And the principles here of the organization is consensus building, because you need consensus if you want to develop standards, declarations, conventions that everybody will adhere to, because you cannot impose those. So when you are developing a declaration like a Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, it is developed through a dialogue between governments and experts coming from different parts of the world, driven by different social, political, economic realities, driven by different set of values. So it is a matter of negotiation between governments and a matter of in the end, agreeing on a set of standards and principle. Now, you can argue that then you may have a consensus on the lowest common denominator, but it is better to have a consensus on the lowest common denominator than not to have a consensus at all or no denominator at all, because then everything goes. If you do not agree to a declaration that says that human cloning for reproductive purposes is not acceptable to the international community, unless that is set in a declaration of principles, then tomorrow any country can host scientists who will start reproducing, cloning people. So consensus building is important. The second principle is intellectual and moral solidarity that is actually built in the Constitution of UNESCO. Social justice and human rights, expertise, and the build-up of research policy spaces for dialogue in order, again, to engage in a process of policy making that is not just derived from knowledge that is produced, but also that is derived from a dialogue with policymakers, civil society organizations, in order to build consensus on what is it that can be done, taking into account all the constraints that policymakers are facing, those constraints that Dennis mentioned, because, and it is legitimate, the politician has election in 4 or 5 years' time, and the social scientist, if he is wrong, will not necessarily lose his job, so he can peddle any kind of recommendations. Now, but all these principles, when adhered to, also strengthen the moral authority of the organization, its credibility, albeit in a different ways than Amnesty. While Amnesty was about facts and law, UNESCO, I would say, it's about concepts and paradigm. Now, there are constraints to both. The constraints is the principle of national sovereignty, and which means non-interference in the affairs of other states. But that principle is restrained by the principle of international obligations of states as defined by international law, agreement, and the principle of mutual accountability, and collective scrutiny agreed upon by states when they ratify convention and sign up on declaration. But still, the tension exists, and the tension is exacerbated by bad faith and by double standards in international organizations. And the second major constraint, I would argue, is the insufficient resources. For instance, even if Amnesty has a principle of universal coverage, it lacks the resources, financial resources, and staff to monitor violations of human rights in 192 countries day in and day out. And therefore, priorities have to be set in terms of countries where serious violations occur and other countries where those incidences are not systematic. And in the case of UNESCO, resources are lacking for capacity building. If you want to organize international cooperation, international intellectual cooperation, you need to ensure that all states are at the same level. It's very difficult for states that do not have the capacity, be it in science, in education, etc., to cooperate internationally on the same level if they don't have the resources at hand. But at the end of the day, be it conformity to facts, honesty and good faith, they are all moral choices when you are in a position of authority, and I'm talking about now the staff in those organizations. There is nothing I have found in the institutional frameworks of UNESCO that prevent it. You can therefore speak truth to power. Now, you may lose your job, but I would argue that it's better than to lose your soul. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierre. This double experience is certainly very enlightening. We come now to Francis Sejersted, who is a professor of history, actually economic historian, I think, and he played also roles in his government, the Norwegian government. He was also former chairman of the Norwegian Nobel Committee and also chaired the Government Freedom of Expression Commission in Norway. So particularly apt to deal with these kind of issues. Please.
Thank you. Well, my perspective is the perspective of an historian. And after having listened to Jon Elster this morning, I think it's most appropriate not to start with the history and the historians, as one usually does, but end up with the historian, as he really advised, as his advice was. Well, in the introduction to his seminal book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, Karl Popper writes that what he attempts to show by this book is that our civilization, and I quote, has not yet fully recovered from the shock of its birth, the transition from tribal and or closed society with its submission to magical forces, to the open society which sets free the critical powers of man. The book attempts to show that the shock of this transition is one of the factors that have made possible the rise of those reactionary movements which have tried and still try to overthrow civilization and to return to tribalism. And a little further down, he continues, the book tries to examine the application of the critical and rational methods of science to the problems of the open society. And it tries to clear away some of the obstacles impeding a rational approach to the problem of social reconstruction. So far, Karl Popper. The book was written during World War II, but the message, I think, is just as applicable today. The deciding factor in the process towards the open society was the scientific revolution. The scientific way of thinking is based, as we know, on the belief that truth is reached through a secular, culture-independent and dialectic process. The latter entails that truth is arrived at by means of debate, where assertions put forward can be corrected in confrontation with new information and other opinions. We humans are fallible, and but by investigating matters and by listening to each other, we can learn more and view matters differently, so that we acquire more well-founded opinions. Our fallibility requires that we join forces in our reasoning. If we are not familiar with counter-arguments, we cannot know whether we are right. As the two other speakers emphasized, all evidence is imperfect, but that leaves us with the process on how to get on to better evidence, better truth, better information. These methods for finding what is true and trustworthy, originally taken from scientific research, have been made the basis for political order in our open democratic societies. But it has been a long way to go, and it may still be difficult to speak truth to power, as indeed was illustrated by the other speakers. Perhaps it is still something in what Popper wrote about 70 years ago, that our societies have still not fully recovered from the shock of its birth. There are still forces in our societies which try to circumscribe the critical powers. In the history of mankind, it has been the rule that societal authorities have taken control of the flow of information or the communication in society. Normally, in the history of mankind, there has been no freedom of expression or information. Open political debate has been restricted, and it has been dangerous to criticize those in power. But social order cannot be based on coercive power alone. It must be built on established and generally acknowledged authoritative relations. It has therefore been essential for the rulers to take control of the texts that constitute the basis for the social orders and of the interpretations of these texts, that is, over the priesthood and the teachers of the people. In short, to build up an authoritative interpretation of the world which legitimizes the hierarchical order of society. Historically, the main barrier to freedom of expression was always the assumed need for protection of authority. Nevertheless, it has always been critical voices, of course, individuals and groups who have challenged orthodox views and provoked the authorities. To simplify, we can say that there has been 4 major court cases in our history concerning freedom of information and expression in the history of our civilization. Or should we say 4 prominent assaults on authoritarian societies from philosophy, religion, science, and art, respectively. The first of these court cases was that against Socrates, who was accused for seducing and corrupting the young by posing critical and pertinent questions. He had to pay with his own life, as he was forced to empty the cup of hemlock poison. The second was against Jesus of Nazareth, which concerned religious heresies. As we know, he also had to pay with his own life. The third was the Inquisition's trial of Galileo Galilei in 1633. Galilei holds a prominent place in the history of science and philosophy. Thank you. the basis for the Inquisition's accusations was that he in 1616 publicly had given his approval to the theory of heliocentrism. That is the idea developed by Copernicus that Earth is in daily motion about its axis and in yearly motion around the Sun. It is part of the history that Copernicus had not dared to publicize his findings until he laid on his deathbed in 1543. The very idea that Earth was not the center of the universe was considered heretical and a threat to the world view on which the established society was built. Galileo was forced to renounce his theory, but was nevertheless sentenced to lifelong imprisonment. He was, however, reprieved by the Pope. As the fourth case, court case, which represented a threat to the order of society from the arts, and which led to prohibition of publication, we can choose the trial, or rather the trials of James Joyce in the 1920s. His path-breaking novel, Ulysses, was for a long time forbidden in the US and the Great Britain, as it was considered obscene. The moral order of society was threatened. There were, of course, many other court cases, but the four we have chosen are among the most spectacular and demonstrate how the threats to social order could come from different quarters, from philosophy, religious, heretics, science, and arts. They also demonstrate a very long history from Socrates to James Joyce of the imagined need for protection of political authority, protection from the truth, among other things. Only a few cases were, of course, put before the courts. There are, of course, a lot of examples of people withholding their findings or opinions due to fear of prosecution. We have already mentioned Copernicus. We also know that Charles Darwin waited for many years before publishing the insights which became the origin of species. It was indeed a serious matter to challenge the idea of creation according to Genesis. This confrontation is still not over, as we know. There are also many examples of people fleeing from fear of prosecution in their own homeland. A prominent example in our history is Thomas Hobbes, who happened to live in the troubled times of the English Civil War in the 1640s. The troubles of the times were indeed reflected in his political writings, but his aim was to examine the preconditions for a stable and peaceful society rather than to take part in the current confrontations. He thought he had a special contribution to make because he was producing a science of politics, a science producing timeless truths. The result being, however, that he managed to antagonize both parties in the conflict. First, he had to flee from England to Paris, where he joined the Royal Exile Court. But after having published Leviathan in 1651, he was accused for having given too much credit to Cromwell, so he had to flee back to England. After the Restoration, he was protected by the king, Charles II, but only on the condition that he should not publicize. And in Oxford University, they burnt his books. And other political theorists who had to flee from European country, from one European country to another, was Karl Marx. As we know, the threat was no longer so much from natural sciences as from the social sciences. There are still many countries with more or less despotic regimes in which it is dangerous to speak truth, as we know. The many murders of journalists and the imprisonment of scientists in many countries today are examples of this. All the more or less despotic regimes have a problem. In order to pursue an effective policy, they need a realistic view of the world. So the problem is how to get access to the truth. Machiavelli was well aware of the problem, of course, And in The Prince, he has a chapter called How Flatterers Must Be Shunned. His advice to the prince is as follows, and I cite, "There is no other way of guarding oneself against flattery than letting men understand that they will not offend you by speaking the truth. But when everyone can tell you the truth, you lose respect. A prudent prince must therefore take a third course by choosing for his counsel wise men and giving these alone full liberty to speak the truth to him, but only of those things that he asks and of nothing else. But he must ask them about everything and hear their opinion, and afterwards deliberate by himself in his own way. And in these councils and with each of these men comport himself so that everyone may see that the more freely he speaks, the more he will be acceptable." End of citation. I think it's tempting to say that this paragraph demonstrates the problem rather than solving it. Not only are prudent princes few and far between, more important is the fact that this group of wise men have no guarantee that the prudent prince will not take offense. There will always be limits, and if they are overstepped, the wise men can easily find themselves in a dangerous position. The difficult access to truth is one of the reasons why despotic regimes can be so fragile. Most of us knew that the Soviet Union was repressive and economically inefficient, but we thought that it was at least stable. It was not. Also, in the open societies of the liberal democracies, there are problems, of course, as we know, even if they are of a somewhat different sort from those we find in despotic regimes. First, liberal democracies have an institutionalized opposition. Oppositional parties not only have the right to criticize those in power, it is their duty to do so. Second, we have an institutionalized science differentiated from political power and with its own norms for reaching the truth. Third, we have come some way towards the application of the critical and rational methods of science also to the political problems. On the other hand, we are warned by Popper that there are still forces which try to circumscribe the critical powers of man. Politics are indeed not always instructed by reason, even in our societies, as we very well know, and which was demonstrated by the other speakers. Your long list, Denise, of all the other factors in influencing the politicians and politics. The problem of speaking truth to power in the liberal democracies is not the threat of prosecution in the first place. And I sought on the internet on different blogs for exchange of views on the topic speaking truth to power. And in the blog of certain Jim Grisancio, there was an interesting exchange of opinions on this topic. And Grisancio introduces the theme in the following way, and I'm citing, "I've always felt the phrase speaking truth to power was a waste of time. I mean, really, who in power listens? It is not in their interest to listen to us, right? We may think they listen because we have the right to speak openly, and many people around the world have no such freedom. But I've always had my doubts that the powerful even know we exist, let alone listen to us." He cites Noam Chomsky, who, according to Grisancio, describes speaking to truth to power as a waste of time. But because, and I cite, because power already know the truth, they don't have to hear it from us. You have to speak truth to people. This is contradicted by one of the participants, and I cite again, "The problem is usually not that power knows the truth and chooses not to act on it, but rather that it is surrounded with voices that shun the truth for their own immediate gain." So the question is, in fact, the degree to which the truth is relevant to those in power. Chomsky's view that one should rather speak truth to the people is interesting as it reflects the tendency that politicians tend to be attentive to the public opinion. To be listened to, one should in the first place put the mark of reason, the truth, on public opinion. This is in accordance with the idea of the importance of a public debate in the open societies, which was one of the topics I might have said yesterday. To reach the powerful in open society, one should go via the public. This is also in accordance with the final intervention in the blog exchange we refer to, and I'm citing, attempts to make change by grassroots efforts are only effective when one has sufficient charisma and time to campaign for that change and the ability to enlist numerous followers. Well, scientists, and I have in particular in mind the social scientists, do of course speak to power. And they are also listened to, of course. But we all know about the dangers of being too closely integrated into the decision-making process. It is always difficult to keep a clear distinction between means and end. The politicians have their own agenda, and in their busy daily life, it can be inconvenient to be confronted with too much truth which is not in line with their preconceived ideas or agendas. As indeed it must have been for the Inquisition in the time of Galileo or for Machiavelli's prince. The well-known Norwegian sociologist Willem Aubert warned against the development by which the social sciences became too instrumental and argued that they should rather aim at being educational, which of course implies that they should speak to people rather than to power, putting the mark of reason on public opinion, if you may. It is important that science care for its differentiated and independent status in the modern society, and it may do so more easily by being educational than by being instrumental. And that was what really concerned Aubert too, that being instrumental, they were too tightly integrated into the decision-making process and too much based on the premises of those in power. On the other hand, we know that there are many different voices out there in the public sphere. We are back where we started with Popper's contention that our civilization has not fully recovered from the shock of its birth. We have certainly come a long way towards setting the critical powers of man free, but there are still forces out there which will try to circumscribe these powers. It is still a formidable task, not least for the scientists, to apply the critical and rational methods of science to the problems of the open society, to speak truth to power. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. I think we have enough stimuli to have a debate. We have 3/4 of an hour, so please.
Klaus Allerbeck, I'm a sociologist from the University of Frankfurt. The focus of my question is very narrow. It deals just with statistics and the upcoming round of censuses in this world. My knowledge is limited. I know two countries' statistics a little bit better. One is the former colony that has a constitution which mandates that the census has to be taken every 10 years. The country which knows now that the president instead of the Commerce Bureau is in charge, that the census is a wonderful tool for gerrymandering. And the first question is how this situation can be turned around in that much that the world round of censuses gets more political attention than before, especially where there are things, subjects such as migrant workers between Mexico and the United States, which may not be legal, but have to be counted as well. And the subject of education that was already brought up, I understand that there's an education census sort of to follow this round, this world round of statistics. I'm not quite sure about that. That is really a question I have. I have one remark to make on statistics in Germany. I think when I met our convener, 1970, we were just beginning in Germany to become more modern, to build statistics and social science into the mechanisms of government. And I think this has gone, and I would suggest that you can observe it in the next weeks or so, has gone a bit too far trying to get social scientific truth into the mechanisms of power. At the end of last month, the economic institutes on the payroll of the government agreed, they didn't lie, they just agreed that the GDP decline in Germany this year would be 6%. Flat agreed on 6%. Now everybody who has the models on his PC in Excel or whatever knows what the impact of this would likely be, but we have, the political process has decided to do this in slow motion and have a consensus estimate of the impact of this on taxes that is to be published Thursday this week. So I would just like to point this out as perhaps a case in point that has to be observed. If we do not have 1 hour like in Canada to, to react to statistics, but have the whole process in slow motion for 3 weeks. And I just want to direct your attention to this. What happens if the mechanism for finding statistical truth is built into the systems of power?
Should we take them or react immediately? Maybe you want to answer right away?
It was quite specific.
Yes, right. That's, I think,
right away. On the census round, of course, not all countries of the world still do population censuses, and indeed we're in Scandinavia where censuses are built up from register systems rather than collection of data in the conventional census way. But if we look at developing countries, then obviously without reasonable population registers and so on, the vital registration systems in many countries is very weak, then censuses are absolutely critical. And 49% of the African population lives in countries that hasn't had a census in the last 10 years. And that is absolutely, phenomenally disastrous in terms of planning good systems, education systems, health systems, economic systems for Africa. So I think, you know, as a world economy, it's something that we have to address, is how we get better resources for regular data collection through vital registration systems and through censuses. And, I mean, there are campaigns for such funding. There's also systems of trying to twin developed countries with developing countries so that there's a partnership to try and support data collection through censuses. But we've still got major problems, and you know, we've even got some countries of the world that haven't had census collections since the mid-1970s. In some cases, and I'm thinking of one country in particular, which is the Lebanon, one of the difficulties is that the government is not a stable government, and it is reliant upon assumptions about the balance across religious groups that do not currently hold. And there's concerns that if there were data collection that would show that these data these assumptions were incorrect, it would destabilize the country. And that's quite a phenomenal situation to be in, because I obviously believe in the importance of good information for managing of countries, but that is not a universally held belief. On the issue of interference with statistics and access, there are fascinating cultural differences. Some years ago, I was in a meeting of official statisticians, and the Director General of Statistics in Canada was talking about how the finance minister was provided access to the GDP data 1 hour before the press got it, and the finance minister in effect was locked in a room with his advisors for this hour so that he could prepare what he was going to say when the data went live an hour later. And we were discussing this as a protection, and the Director General of Statistics for Russia at the time sat and listened and then asked a question and said, he really didn't understand how this system worked in Canada, and please could the Director General of Statistics explain what they did if the finance minister wished to change the GDP. So we have great cultural differences. I think they are diminishing, but there are still huge cultural differences. And indeed, any of you who are interested in going to the website of the International Statistics Institute, we will see correspondence there that we've had as the Professional Association of Statisticians with the Director of Statistics in Argentina, and also with the Director of Statistics in IMF, to address concerns about the manipulation of data in Argentina in order to fulfill IMF requirements, or apparently fulfill IMF requirements. So it's still, in many countries, in many situations, we still have a political environment for data collection and use.
Thank you.
My name is Vogt. I am professor at Bergen University here. But we have recently, in the recent wars, got the expression embedded journalists. They ride along with the attackers and give the corresponding reports. But actually, we as social scientists should recognize that we are pretty embedded too. We are embedded in our institutions, university or whatever, and dependent on sources of financing and whatever. So, but from the point of view of a foot soldier, as I might be here, not on the big levels, international levels of statistics and so on, we by instinct try to avoid this type of controversial attacks on revelations and disclosures of corruption in high places. But sometimes we can't avoid it. So I started in the 1970s research on violence in the Bergen area, which is a good subject. Look at the underdogs, the victims of violence, and give a report. The trouble was that we discovered that 7% of the medically treated victims of violence were police victims. What to do then? Most sensible people would have said they are only interested in civil violence. And that's actually, later on I tried to participate in an American study of violence till I discovered that they excluded police violence. They coined the phrase civil violence. That was what interested them. So that didn't suit me. Anyhow, we then had to be very careful And for years, we examined our data and made all sorts of tests, so that in 81 we published these 7% police violence. And hell broke loose, as some might remember. For 20 years, we had problems being surveyed by the police, being persecuted or examined, all sorts of crimes we should have committed and whatever. But let's not get into details. But wise researchers, they exclude that type of data that might bring them into problems. All our financial sources froze up, of course. The newspapers were against us, revealing our, yes. But whatever, this is one example of the difficulties of avoiding being embedded and dependent on research. Another piece of criminological research that in a town, in another town in Bergen in Norway, I have been directing a study of organized crime, sex, drugs, whatever. We have disclosed 11 murders, often disguised as overdose and so on. And my man down there, in the end, found some hard evidence that would make it possible to publish these without becoming liable to trouble. He phoned me, said, come to the town tomorrow, and I'll tell you, we can't speak on the phone. Okay, the next day he was dead. I, of course, tried to get it investigated as a murder case, but in vain. It was classified as an OD, in spite of the fact that he was not a drug addict at all. Whatever. I just say that on this level, we should also communicate some of our experiences, because they might enlighten the problem of power in social science.
Thank you. I think that's an important integration. Actually, in the presentation of this panel, we refer to it because we say that the session links the fact that certain topics are considered taboo among professional social scientists themselves, creating another threat to the freedom of inquiry. So that's certainly a relevant point. I don't know if then we want to comment in the last round. There are other? Please.
My name is Abraham Friedman. I'm the Dean of the College of Management in Israel, and I'm the chairperson of the Social and Human Sciences sector of the Israeli UNESCO Committee and member of the MOST Committee in Paris. One issue is the issue of marketing your data. I think, in my experience, I had the pleasure of serving my government. I was in charge of setting wages and conditions of work of the whole public sector. And in one cabinet meeting, I went with all the data, presented half an hour, then the Prime Minister says, okay, a very interesting presentation, but I have a cousin that when I look upon its paycheck, I'm so bewildered. And I feel so bad that I can't tolerate it. And then two ministers with cousins, neighbors, and so on, decided on the wage policy of the teachers, which means that you have to package your data in a way that will suit the audience. I think that there is one way that to present it to the cabinet, another way that you present it to journalists, a third way to the general public, and a fourth way to your academic community. And this is something I'm a statistician by myself. I studied for all my degrees. I have a major in statistics, so I'm coming from the occupation. And this is something that we usually don't feel that we have to do it this way. It's not betraying our cause. That's why. And the other thing, the other comment is, we speak about accessibility to data and the fact that we demand in financial markets and so on that everybody should have an access to the data. I think there is another very important, and you touched it in a way, is accessibility to the way that to know the tools of interpretation, to know how to interpret the data. And we know that the major debates, and you mentioned it, between scholars is really what the data means. And the fact is that we don't have consensus about what the data means. And in this way, we lose the trustworthiness of the data. Because if it doesn't have one meaning, if it's ambiguous, so whatever you do, it's okay. We just will find a way to interpret the data that it suits your policy. Thank you.
Thank you. We continue to collect. Please. Please. Yes.
It's okay?
Yes.
So I'm Naim Busaina from Sudan, a very complicated country actually, and it's true, yeah, I know. But the problem is that, for example, when you are speaking the truth, taking the situation of now of Darfur in Western Sudan, especially for the gentleman I know from the UNESCO who is work also with Amnesty International. We had now the problem is that always, actually I lived for a while in Europe and then I went back home and now I'm working in Juba University in Sudan. Then I'm in Sudan. The Sudanese always, they're thinking that is what is coming out is from outside, I mean, from the UN organizations, Amnesty International, now the ISSC declaration that Umar al-Bashir is wanted or something like. So the thing is that is the people are acting very emotionally against what is coming from outside, from the international, especially international organizations. They are always thinking, although I'm totally anti-government, anti the government, but what come out from the ICC now, for example, make Omar al-Bashir, our president, which is totally a very bad person from my point of view, make him as a hero, in the sense of that is the people are reacting totally emotional. That is, he is a Sudanese, okay, and why only us? That is, we have been, looked as the bad people. There is a lot of people who are doing a lot of bad things. Why only us? So the thing is that is how you, evaluate the thing is that is when you are saying the truth. Is that the wise? The wise time, using saying the truth itself, how you can say it also in a diplomatic way, in the sense of to be accepted from you are sending a message for the people inside the country. You are meaning people. For example, us as Sudanese, I want to change my society, and I want to change the government. But the way of what is the UN or the Amnesty International reports or human rights reports about what is going on in Sudan sometimes make the Sudanese themselves reacting against the reports. So the question is that how you can send the message which has to be accepted inside the country itself from the people who have been sent the message to them. That is in the sense of you changing the beliefs or the mentality of the people, and then you make them reacting positively according to your data you are sending. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Others? Otherwise, well, in this case, we can have maybe, oh, please. Can you come here?
Hello, my name is Nazanin. I'm Iranian, but I'm studying sociology in the US, UC Berkeley right now. I have a general question. Pierre Sané started his lecture by talking about the 3 different elements in the title of the panel: speaking truth, speak, truth, and power. And he left the 2 out. And I think what I felt listening to the panelists was that this was speaking truth among the powers, not to the powers. And perhaps that's why 2 was left out from the original definition. Because the respected panelists here, to me, they seem to be the powers. They are all in the positions of power: director general, heads of schools. And I think especially the first 2 lectures were mostly directed toward how truth is produced. Whereas when I came to listen to this panel, I was expecting to hear how I can speak to powers, not how the truth is being produced. And that's why I'm saying the panelists talked from their positions of power, because it's the powers who usually define the good truth, the truth, the good data. And so this is basically a remark, because when I was listening to the panelists, I was thinking that a good data for me is not a data driven by policy, but a good policy is a policy driven by data that is relevant to the people. So basically that's what I was expecting to hear, and also how I can share or how I can have a say in the powers that define good data and the truth. Thank you.
Okay. There is a short rejoinder to this. Then, please.
To link my account to the panel, the Amnesty International got interested in police violence in Norway from our report, and sent very distinguished people from London to investigate this. Anyhow, they came here, they were surveilled by the police every step, and the press rattled against them for taking the side of these criminals who the police had treated so well. It leads us up with you. Anyhow, 7 of our informers were sentenced to prison in 9 months, and so about 4 having slandered the police to us and thereby to the public. And it took 10 years before the Supreme Court squashed those miscarriages of justice.
I see. Please.
Thank you very much, Adebayo Olukoshi from Senegal. I wanted to continue in the same vein with the lady who intervened by inviting the panel to probably help us to problematize the truth a bit more, because it's not evident in a lot of cases what the truth is. And a lot of times, depending on the corner in which you find yourself, there can be many truths. So which truth is to be spoken, and to which power at the end of the day seems to me to be an important element of what we are called to grapple with here. In a lot of cases also, I think we are confronted with a situation in which in actual life we are either speaking within the parameters of power or at some proximate distance to power and some relative distance to power, right? You could be in power, you could be an advisor, you could be a prince, an advisor to the prince, right? And you could be an ordinary citizen, far from the centers of power and of decision making. And it seems to me here that the dilemma we are confronted with, somebody used the notion of the embedded journalists of today who are allowed to report only what the military with whom they are embedded want them to show to the rest of us on CNN, BBC, and elsewhere. At the end of the day, it seems to me that the challenge between what we would call entryism and being a critic from outside of the structures of power is a real one that we are confronted with. How do you bring about meaningful change in society if the essence of speaking truth to power is to bring about change? How do you bring about meaningful change when, in fact, many of those who become entryists into the structures and processes of power become themselves overwhelmed by power, right? And plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. And yet, while you're outside of the structures of power, you are probably throwing stones at the glass house, but those who are inside are securely protected by the glass walls and really don't care what you say.
You can have a round of answers now, I think. At the right moment. So please, you start.
Okay, right. Picking a few of the important points that were made. I mean, I would like to speak to the Iranian and Senegalese friends. The first thing I would say to the young woman from Iran is, when I was your age, I thought a head of school was a senior empowered position. When you get to be head of school, actually it doesn't feel like that at all. But I think the issue is, of course, there are many truths. I was speaking about official statistics collection, and I was assuming that we were talking about collection that could only be done by governments. I think it's a whole different talk about the data collection that you do outside of the government system, the importance of non-governmental organisations involved in data collection, the importance of us having a rich array of different sorts of information from different perspectives. And then, of course, the issue is how do we share this information and how do we ensure that we can challenge information, both information that comes from government systems and information created from other organisations. I didn't talk much about user involvement. I should have done, and obviously user involvement is really critical. And as I tried to make the point, it's critical in terms of setting the agenda, not just in terms of interpretation. And a lot of countries have involved users in terms of the interpretation and use of information, but they don't involve a broader community in terms of setting the agenda and determining what ought to be collected. And I think that's an area we've got to pay attention to, because I would agree that there isn't such a thing as neutral data or neutral social science. There's a context, a framework within which these are collected. Just by what you choose to collect, you're reflecting your own perspective. So I agree. I don't think it's an issue we have tackled seriously enough. And one of the things that I'm concerned about in relation to the statistical community is how we involve a greater range of users in the determination of what's collected. Just a couple of other points. The issue was made about communication, and it's why I put a slide in countering Sir Gus O'Donnell's comment that statistics should be boring. I think it's absolutely critical that we improve our communication skills, that we learn how to communicate quantitative material as well as qualitative material. Qualitative researchers are generally much, much better at communication. Anecdotes and case studies can speak much, much more powerfully sometimes than numbers. We have to learn how to communicate with numbers much better. Somebody who's done some amazing work in this area is a Swedish sociologist, Hans Rosling. And I would encourage you to go and Google Hans Rosling and look at some of his presentations of quantitative information over time. It's really exciting developments. The other point I wanted to make was to pick up on something Pierre Sani said. I talked about my difficulties in understanding whether the UN is an organization of countries or an organization of peoples. He put it in a much better way than I did. He talked about the sort of the tension between the sovereignty of nations and the international commitments. And that's really what I was trying to say when I said that we have difficulties in calling governments to account when governments have signed up to international commitments, but in doing this in ways that doesn't violate their sovereignty. And I think the lady from Sudan spoke very powerfully to this, but how do we actually work with people within countries to overthrow despots, and how, what are our responsibilities as social scientists in terms of gathering information that can be used effectively in this way.
In this way, yes.
Thank you.
Francis, and then Pierre, or Pierre? No.
Yes.
Pierre.
Okay. The question that the lady from Sudan has raised is a difficult one. That is, how can your message reach the people in a situation where you have propaganda by the government, and especially in countries where the means of communication, the media, is controlled by the government, and the information that reaches out to the people is mainly coming through the press, because the people will not go and read the Amnesty report, even though it is easier now because they can go on the internet and find the report. But the report will be introduced to the people in the country by the press, and the press will be quoting selectively, etc. And that reaction is not specific to Sudan. I think what the gentleman has just told us is that there were recently a report of Amnesty International on police brutality in Norway, and the press reacted negatively. Okay, so you see, it is not just in the case of Sudan. The press reacts positively, that is, okay, I'm talking about my time, that's 10 years ago. I don't know what is happening now. Reacts positively when it is violations committed in other countries, especially when it is a foe and it is an enemy. If you have a report on violations of human rights in Zimbabwe, you will get a lot of coverage in the UK. But if you publish a report on human rights violations in UK prisons, not only will you be ignored by the press, but the press that will cover that report will say that Amnesty has lost its sense of priorities, because the UK is a country where human rights generally are respected, and therefore the resources should be directed to cover what the despots are doing in Africa. But so that is to say that it is a standard response by the press, by the governments, because no governments want to be presented as failing on their international obligations to respect and protect human rights. Now, in the case of the indictment, the statutes of the International Criminal Court are very clear. That is, the court intervenes when the governments in the country, the justice system, fails to intervene or is unwilling to intervene. The court intervenes in countries that have ratified the statutes, or when it is requested by the Security Council to pursue that case. Now, it is in the court of law that we will establish whether indeed Omar al-Bashir is guilty of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. For the moment, these are allegations. The prosecutor has investigated. He feels he has a solid case But then it will be in the court of law that he will have to prove that, and Omar al-Bashir, I suppose, will have an army of lawyers. So the court of law will have to decide that. So that's the point where he is. Now, it's the tactics maybe that could be difficult to understand, but when you are outside of the court, it's very difficult to second guess, because the prosecutor could have indicted him without making the indictment public, like they did in the case of Bemba, who was arrested in Belgium. He didn't know that there was an arrest warrant against him. He was arrested and whisked to the tribunal. Maybe they could have done the same thing with Bashir, but they decided to go public, maybe because they wanted public debate in Sudan. Maybe that's what they wanted. I don't know if it will backfire. We don't know yet. It's too early to say. But I'm sure there are clearly, we've seen the position taken by El-Turabi. El-Turabi said that Bashir should respond to the charges and go to the court. So we don't know. And certainly in a country like Sudan, there are people waiting in the corners that will use this indictment to get rid of Omar al-Bashir in order to take over for themselves. Now, on the questions of talking truth to power, I may have failed to communicate properly my message, because everything I was saying was about talking truth to power. I gave a very brief, short definition of truth, because yes, you can, if you want to define and debate truth, then you can have a conference of 3 days, bring in professional philosophers, and at the end of the day, you will not have an agreement on that. So that's why I said, okay, I take truth just very simple way, facts, close to the facts, etc. And the other one is about honesty, sincerity, and ethics. I defined power by those who have actually the power to control, to decide, to act, to change things, whether it is government, whether it is big business, whether it is heads of the World Bank, and etc. That's the power I'm talking about in the field that I was addressing, that is human rights and ethics, etc. And speaking. So how you communicate that information, because very often you can be speaking without being seen to speak. You can have quiet diplomacy, as long as you have diplomacy. But quiet diplomacy is also a way to speak to power. And I said in my conclusion that if I contrast Amnesty with UNESCO, Amnesty is about the facts compared to the law. So these facts show that the law has been broken somewhere, and that's the content of the speech. And I said UNESCO, it's about concepts and paradigm. UNESCO has invented some very powerful concepts. For instance, World Cultural Heritage. This city has a part of the city which is listed on the World Cultural Heritage, but it is not the fact that a part of the city is protected by the world community. It's the concept that you put in the minds of the people, that there are elements of our history which is common to humanity and that requires protection, be it the old part of Bergen or the pyramids or etc. It's part of the history of humanity. And that is the concept that you are trying to ingrain in the minds of people in order to build concretely solidarity between people. Education for all, it's another concept. Whether we will achieve the targets, etc., etc. But here, the idea is to convince people that education for all is necessary, for all, not just for children in the age of going to school, but throughout life. That education is not just a right, but also it is a value worth pursuing, because that is how you improve your citizenry, that is how you build peace, and that is how you build solidarity. Once you do away with ignorance, then you can have people who can interact with in a way that is tolerant. So when you say universal bioethics and human rights, it's also a powerful concept. So that's why I said UNESCO is in the business of producing concepts and paradigm. Now, the question is not just about speaking truth to power. The question is, will you be heard? Because yes, you can shout in the street, the windows are closed, you are speaking truth to power, but nobody is hearing you and nobody will listen to you. So that's why I said there are certain criteria. If you want to be heard, it's not just a question of speaking. It's a question of being listened to, and it's a question of being heard. And that's why I said, I talked about the set of principles. Because in order to speak truth to power, in order to be listened to, you have to be credible and you have to have an ethical stand so that you are speaking from a position of moral strength, because your power is not the power that the government has. You pretend to speak from a position of moral strength. And that's why I listed the principles. Like in Amnesty, the principle will be accuracy, independence, impartiality, universal coverage. And in UNESCO, I talked about consensus, solidarity, expertise, dialogue, etc. But all of that is to be in a position to speak from a credible voice to power and be heard.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I think the man from Senegal had a very important intervention. And what he asked for was to problematize the concept of truth more than we did. It is a very difficult task indeed, and as Pierre suggested, we should have 3 days to discuss what truth really is about. But I think all the same, we should comment a little more upon it. I do agree with him that we haven't commented enough upon what is really truth. And are we, sitting here in the panel, are we representatives of the power? Yes, to a certain degree, we are representatives of the power. We are speaking within the parameters of power. And in the very moment you are listened to, you are part of the power. And that is a sort of paradox, and you can't really, there is no simple solution to that problem. But it's very important that it is stressed and it's pointed to that. And perhaps you should have talked not about speaking truth to power, but how can the powerless speak truth to power? And that was really the question you posed. So it is, and there are different truths, and we all discussed the differences in different truths. And I suggested that and talked about how we should establish a dialogue, and we should always try to be met with counter-arguments in order to come closer to a better understanding on what is trustworthy and what is the truth. So there are different processes by which you could come closer to the truth and to different truths, and so on. And we have to develop these processes. And one of the really important things which was taken up by many of the speakers was the danger of being too closely integrated into the policy making and process of the powerful, and which very easily lead you on to speaking on the premises of those in power. And this is the social sciences in Norway has been criticized for being too closely integrated into the policy-making processes, and that was the reason why I referred to Willem Aubert, that he said it should rather be education and speaking to the people rather than to the politicians. And as an historian, I will also stress that, because history is very traditionally very much concentrated on the educational, and history is not really instrumental in the way that the social sciences has been and still is. But this creates also problems for. We are commissioned, also historians are commissioned. We are more independent. I think, on the whole, historians have an established way of working which is more independent because it's more educational than instrumental. And we are not influenced to the same degree by the power as the social sciences is because of this way of integrating, as you say, the different sciences, social sciences and history into the society. But we also have our problems, and I've experienced that. We are commissioned, we have lots of projects commissioned by, for instance, the ministries and things. I've been working with the history of the Minister of Finance, for instance, and we had conflicts after having published the first volume. There was a conflict, and we had to withdraw. It was stopped. The whole project was stopped by the Minister of Finance. So also historians, they didn't like it, and we what they anticipated that we should write in the second volume. So we also have experienced this very powerful influence and the difficulties in creating that sort of distance which we need, and the independence which should be the norm. I can add I was the project manager of a project on the history of the Supreme Court in Norway, and we had really conflicts, very hard conflicts within the editorial board, which ended with the representative of the Supreme Court itself withdrawing from the editorial board. So we had to just continue without representatives from the Supreme Court, and it was commissioned by the Ministry of Justice. So they didn't react in the same way as the Supreme Court itself. But it ended up with quite successfully, and also in the end, the Supreme Court was very satisfied with the result. But this is also, we historians have experienced these clashes, these conflicts with those in power, and we also have commissioned research, not in the very same way as the social sciences, but in the way I have described. And this also creates problems. But on the whole, I do feel, and we are back to Jon Elster's final phrases in his speech today, that which history has really something to contribute to this whole problem and to the processes which we have been discussing. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I defend the way in which the topic was addressed here, because I think that speaking truth to power means different things. One is certainly to unmask, denounce interpretation of reality, which can be provided by power holders, and trying to restore, let's say, a different truth. But on the other hand, it may also mean to provide reliable information and interpretations for having more effective and democratic decision-making. Why not? And in order to do that, it is good that the people here have some power, because otherwise they're not heard at all. And the best way to control power, by the way, power is absolutely needed. If you want to decide something, to change something, power is needed, is a resource. Unfortunately, those who have power tend to wish to continue to hold it, and possibly also to, adapt it to their own personal interest as well. So, the best way to control power is to have countervailing powers. And if we can mobilize a type of power which is based on social science, good. Why should also? Because in this way we can contest when decision makers say, we didn't know. We couldn't expect these effects or this impact of our decision. Nobody told us that. We didn't have the necessary information. This is very often heard in this time of a global crisis. No, we have to do our job in this way, and if we can act as a kind of countervailing power, is good. So I think that certainly we should speak truth to power to the people, but also to decision makers. It's not a useless effort and endeavor, provided that we have the principles, the criteria of sound, honest scholarship that was presented here. I just remind you that this is in a series, this our workshop. Yesterday there was in the corridors of power. Today there will be something on science ethics, ensuring research integrity, which is very much connected, of course. And then also there is the plenary session tonight at 5:30, Peter Piot, which is what social science can provide for policymakers. So that's are different ways to continue our debate. Thank you to our panelists and thank you to you all.
Thank you very much.